I think a lot about non-reciprocal relationships and how these structures of power extract from one community to deliver to another, and how when I turn my lights on, that power is coming from somewhere else, and when I turn my tap on, that water is coming from somewhere else. And I think about the community on the other end of that. Everything that we have is sourced from somewhere, and for the most part, we're very disconnected from those processes. I think a really important part of the piece is the interconnectedness of everything. So it's the interconnectedness of the lines by which we live, whether those be power lines or borders or highways. The fact is, everything is connected. I think the Antelope Valley is a really incredible site to be having these conversations, because right here in the local area, there is wind power, solar power, the meeting of the California and the LA aqueduct, and also lithium farms. So there's so much in this landscape about how we live and how we survive that I really wanted the piece to touch on many aspects of that. Networks of Power is situated on a piece by Nathaniel Ancheta called Platform. And Platform is a 32-foot square platform constructed of mirrored acrylic panels that are discussing the proliferation of solar fields in the Antelope Valley. Nathaniel is actually from the Antelope Valley and has seen the land change throughout his lifetime. One of the things I love so much about this piece is that it's never the same. So it changes from minute to minute according to the sky, according to the time of day, according to the wind. And Networks of Power was really designed in the same way in order to enable the landscape to really be a part of the piece itself. The structure of the main body of the piece is thinking about the grid, and that can apply many different ways. Obviously, in this situation, it's referring directly to solar and wind and how energy is piped into houses. But when I think about the grid, I also think about highways. I also think about streets. I think about cartography. So it's really acknowledging how the grid affects everybody. And whatever our thoughts or feelings are on it, we live within the grid. And the grid sort of chooses for us how we access what really now are basic human rights in terms of access to water, access to power, access to clean air. And then here, this structure is representing the substation. So the substation is this sort of mothership, for lack of a better term, and is the sort of source of where the power is coming from. And I also wanted to make something that is kind of clearly a structure of power. And the substation is both physical and metaphorical structure of power. In this case, we haven't specifically attached it to the grid because that process is invisible. And that's really where a lot of this piece comes from, is the invisibility of the process of how we get the things that keep us going, like power, like water. So these little guys, these little triangles are obviously inspired by wind power. And they're also made of copper, so again, it's a kind of material of the physicality of power. One of the things I really love about it is that depending on not just the time of day, but also the wind, it's like each of these have a sort of, there's a kind of musicality to it because they all move at their own pace and they're obviously all at their own height. So I like to think of it as almost like a small power orchestra. You get the sound of the wind, occasionally you get the sound of copper on copper, like little clinks happening. And I think there's a real kind of resonance in this landscape, both by the wind, but also by the solar fields themselves. If you visit a solar field and you stand next to a tower, there's a physical resonance that you can feel within your body. And the hope is that by having these activated by the wind and reflecting the landscape, both physically and metaphorically, that those resonances become a little bit more accessible to us as a way to kind of tune in with the landscape that we're in and how that land is changed by industry. I want to think more about these lines and these structures of permission that we live by and start to trace them, to understand how they impact on a very local level you and me and our neighbors and our families and our friends. I also want to be more conscious of my own consumerism and where my power comes from, and to start to do my own homework in this. And I have no idea how we change it, but to think about how to start. and to think about how to build non-extractive processes that can allow us to thrive and move away from the level of consumerism that we've been taught to believe is okay, because it's just not. It's not sustainable. And so this piece is trying to ask a lot of those questions in a hope that we all start to ask more of those questions and try and figure out how we can have some agency over these systems that feed the beast, but also keep us going. So it's kind of a necessary evil in some ways, but it's also one that I think with thought and consideration, we can think about the next generation of how we behave and how we treat each other and how we care for each other. We have to think more about how we care for these systems and how we care for these processes and how we care for the communities from which the power is coming. And that applies to both personal relationships in industry and government. So I'm in no way saying that this shouldn't exist, because absolutely it should. We have to move away from fossil fuels. But at the same time, we have to do it responsibly, and we have to think about what's going to happen generations from now to the land that we're disrupting. What happens when the solar fields run out of their life? What happens in that 30-year period? What happens when the wind farms need to be deaccessioned? How do we care for the land and communities then? So in a lot of ways, the piece is just asking about the future and understanding that what we're doing is planning for the now, but ultimately we have to plan for the future in order to survive it. This piece begs us to hold the powers that be responsible to ensuring that we move forward responsibly and that we don't make the same mistakes that we've made for hundreds and hundreds of years in developing unsustainable relationships with land and technology and then just moving on without really thinking about what we're leaving behind.